Fire Nerds, this is Chris, and this is going to be my Bloodraven Part 2 video, as we continue our discussion on the powerful tree hugger of our story. Today we'll talk about how Bloodraven got his abilities in the first place, and speculation on what his goals and alliances are. We'll talk about what we do know about him, evidence that he's been at work in our story since the beginning, and what his potential endgame could be. So, is he just a powerful bastard who wants to do some good? Or is he just a bastard? So in part 1 we talked about Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, established who he was, the things he did before our story started, and how he got to be where he is now. We know he's a powerful green seer and skin changer. As a matter of fact, he's called the last green seer by the children of the forest, who were of course one of the races that inhabited Westeros before the first men. And in A Dance with Dragons he talks to Bran as he starts his Jedi training about how the gods mark certain people with red or green eyes to mark them as having the gift of green sight. So of course that goes back to part 1 when we talked about how Bloodraven was born an albino and had red eyes before he lost one to his bastard brother Bittersteel. So he was obviously born with these powers like Bran was, and that kind of confirms what people thought in the Dunk and Egg novels as far as Bloodraven being handed the king, that he probably was in fact a sorcerer. So I talked about how Bran got his powers in my Bran warging ability video, and how that came from the children of the forest, passed over to a sect of the first men who allied themselves with the children of the forest, as well as how that got passed down to a group of first men called the Warg King and his followers, and how they were probably the first humans to get this ability through their DNA. And then of course how the Starks, the old kings of winter, had a war with them over an area called Sea Dragon Point, and how the Starks took their wives and put all their sons and male heirs to the sword. And that of course is how the Starks obtained the DNA to have this potential ability as far as skin changing or green sight, and how that eventually passed down through House Stark. So what about Bloodraven? He's a Targaryen bastard, right? How did he get his powers? So let's quickly talk about Bloodraven, his lineage, and how it connects to the Starks. Now it could be there were other groups of first men who had this ability before the Starks, but if that were the case, I don't think they'd put the short passage in A World of Ice and Fire about the War King story, because that would kind of diminish the importance of House Stark. And of course anybody who would interbreed with House Stark at this point would have the potential to have this ability through their DNA. So this brings us to House Blackwood. Now House Blackwood was another northern house who descended from the first men as well. Now it could be that House Blackwood actually descended from this group of first men called the War King and his followers, because genocide is hard, and the Starks may have missed a few males here and there, because House Blackwood was ran off from what's called the Wolfswood, which is near Sea Dragon Point, and they moved down to an area called Raven Tree Hall near River Run. So technically now they're a southern house who still hold the old gods of the north, formerly a northern house. And as you can see here by their sigil, they do have an old werewood surrounded by ravens. Now over time there were several marriages between House Stark and House Blackwood. So when you're talking about bloodlines of House Stark in particular, most people focus on House Stark because they are the more powerful known house in our story. And they talk about a lot of the Blackwood females that married into House Stark, but they are, well, Starks. So there had to be marriages where female Starks came over to House Blackwood and married into House Blackwood so that they retained that name. And of course, Bloodraven's mother was Melissa Blackwood, the sixth mistress of Aegon IV Targaryen. So Bloodraven, being the son of a Targaryen and a Blackwood, a northern house with Stark blood in their veins, was born with this rare gift in our story. So bloodlines are very important in our story, and I think it's very interesting and very important to look at the fact that there's never been a marriage between a Stark and a Targaryen. Ever. Like none. Like zero, zilch, nada, at least that I'm aware of. Now there was an alliance between the Starks and the Targaryens during what's called the Dance of the Dragons, which was essentially a Targaryen civil war, and it was called the Pact of Ice and Fire, and that was supposed to happen where a Targaryen princess would marry a Stark boy, but that never came to fruition. So with all that said, Bloodraven is the first person in our story to be born of a Targaryen and a northern house with Stark blood in it, him and his sisters of course, and we have no fucking idea what happened to them, except for one other. And that would be of course Mr. Snow, who I think is born of pure Targaryen and pure Stark blood, which makes him super important in our story. Now, there have been Blackwoods marry into House Targaryen, but this was after Bloodraven's birth. Aegon V Targaryen, or Egg as he was called, married Beth of Blackwood out of actual love as opposed to political alliances, and had several children. And of course, another important character in our story, Dany, came from this line of Targaryens and Blackwoods. So there's something going on here in our story about bloodlines between Targaryens and Starks, don't you think? When they do produce a child, they seem to be pretty damn important. So what does Bloodraven want with Bran? After all, he summoned him to the heart tree north of the wall. It wasn't like he could just drive down there and pick him up. I know, that was horrible. I did that in like, 3 minutes. But yes, Bloodraven is literally stuck in a tree. In the books, it's much more descriptive about how Bloodraven looks as opposed to the show. In the show, He just looks like a really old man with long white hair that's sitting in a tree throne, so to speak. In the books, it's much more descriptive. He's literally stuck in the tree. The roots are going through him, through his body. He's basically dead. He's in pretty damn bad condition, and he literally has a root coming out of his eye socket where he lost the eye to Bittersteel. So I think he sent the pregnant direwolf that we saw in season 1 and book 1 down to Winterfell beyond the wall, but this direwolf happened to have the right number of puppies. Aww. For the Stark children. And I think that's how bloodraven got Bran to activate his power, because I think they had to have a direwolf to actually bond with personally so they could kind of unlock their skin changing or warging abilities. I think it's also interesting that Howland Reed sent Jojen and Mira, his children, over to swear fealty to Bran, but did he really send him there to help Bran get to bloodraven? Perhaps Howland Reed knows of bloodraven. He's of the old gods, so maybe he's in on it. We haven't heard from him like ever. Now we will see him in season 6, presumably in a flashback, but hopefully we'll see him in a current state as well and find out if he's tied in with this as well. Perhaps he sent them there because he knew Bran needed to go on this voyage. And speaking of Bran's importance, did bloodraven somehow influence Jaime in the first place to push him out that fucking window? I don't think so, but I think it's interesting because Bran wanted to be a knight. When he was still walking and running and climbing, he wanted to be a knight and ride horses and do all the things his big brothers were doing. But once he fell out of the window, became this kind of broken boy. He then unlocked these wolf dreams as far as him warging into summer. And then, of course, with Jojen and Mira coming there and influencing him as well, I think that's what made him make the decision to actually take this trek to the wall and beyond to find the three-eyed crow. And I think this is probably because bloodraven needs Bran to be his replacement. He is going to eventually shuffle off this mortal coil and go into the trees for good. So I think Bran is going to take his place eventually as the last green seer. Or is bloodraven actually an old god himself? Is that what people label the old gods? People that sit in caves somewhere and can see through the trees. And speaking of religions in A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, we see that in A Dance with Dragons, again when Bran starts his training, bloodraven tells him about the darkness and how the darkness will be his friend and not to be afraid of the darkness. So why do I bring this up? Because it's setting Bran and bloodraven and the old gods up against the Lord of Light or R'hllor and Melisandre from her perspective, because she's always preaching about the light and how the darkness is bad and full of terrors, and bloodraven's preaching to Bran about how the darkness is a great thing. Also, Mel has already seen bloodraven and Bran in her visions in the fire, so that's setting up them to be polar opposites. She's associating bloodraven and Bran with the great other as opposed to like separate old gods, and of course that's going to be the polar opposite of R'hllor and the followers of the Lord of Light. And she saw this in her one chapter in A Dance with Dragons. She actually sees bloodraven and Bran in her visions in the flames, and it reads, "A face took shape within the hearth. Stannis," she thought for a moment. But no, these were not his features, a wooden face, corpse white. Was this the enemy? 1,000 red eyes floating in the rising flames. He sees me. Beside him, a boy with a wolf's face threw back his head and howled. And there's also, she wondered if it had been his face that she had seen staring out at her from the flames. No, surely not. His visage would be more frightening than that, cold and black and too terrible for any man to gaze upon and live. The wood man she had glimpsed, though, and the boy with the wolf's face, they were his servants, surely, his champions, as Stannis was hers. So at the very least, from Melisandre's perspective, Bran and bloodraven are the enemy. Now at the same time, you have other followers of the Red God, specifically back in Meereen, praising Dany as the Savior reborn, because of, well, dragons, I suppose. So anyway, what does bloodraven want with Jon? So I think bloodraven also has a keen interest in Jon because he has seemingly shaped events, or at least helped to influence events in our story so far. We know that bloodraven has been involved with Mormont's Raven, saying things on his shoulder when they were around, not just corn, 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 feed me, but things like snow and king. Also what's very interesting is in the books, when they were picking the new Lord Commander, and Sam put Jon Snow's name in the hat to be Lord Commander, after he had already died, Mormont's Raven actually flew out of a kettle and landed near Jon Snow when it was his turn to talk about why he would be a good Lord Commander, and actually landed on his shoulder. Now the other people thought that this was some kind of trick that Sam had taught this Raven, but I don't think so. I think this was actually bloodraven landing on Jon's shoulder to influence him being the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He wanted to influence the vote and seems to need Jon Snow to be Lord Commander, but why? Does he need Jon to be Lord Commander so he will join up with the wildlings? Does he need Jon to perhaps do this and then perhaps die to fulfill some, I don't know, prophecy? Also, as far as bloodraven influencing things, in the books it's slightly different on when they found the dragon glass. In the show they found it on the Fist of the First Men, but in the books, Ghost, of course Jon's direwolf that happens to be albino with red eyes, actually finds the dragon glass and leads Jon to it. Was that Ghost? Was that just a coincidence? Or was that bloodraven? And going back to bloodlines, does bloodraven know about R plus L equals J, that Jon is the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, which I believe is true? I think he does. I think he knows how important Jon is. But it seems to me that if he needs Jon Snow to become Lord Commander to either join up with the wildlings, to find dragonglass, that's setting him up as being against the others or the White Walkers. Now, it's also interesting to throw this in here real quickly about bloodraven influence in events. I think that what we talked about in part 1, where we actually called the big council to determine the next Targaryen king, I think bloodraven had a hand in actually picking Aegon to be the next king. But why would he do that? Why would he pick Aegon V out of all the Targaryens there that could have been great kings? Even Maester Aemon, who turned it down. Well, Aegon, as I mentioned earlier, actually loved Betha Blackwood. The end result of that marriage ends up being Daenerys. Bloodraven had no children. Jon and Dany are the only two living descendants of a union between ice and fire. So not only are Jon and Dany actually related, Bloodraven is actually related to them and Bran as well. So now, what is Bloodraven's endgame? What are his goals? What does he want? Some people think that he's aligning with the Great Other and somehow controls the White Walkers or the others, and that may be possible. Maybe that was something that went wrong with the Children of the Forest and Bloodraven perhaps. But I personally think he still wants to do some good for the realm. In every single instance throughout his life, he sacrificed and fought for the realms of men. And I think that's probably why he ended up at the wall in the first place, to go beyond and find the Children of the Forest. So he's always fought for the realm. He gave up his honor for the realm, and I really don't see any reason for that to change now. But is he the Great Other? Is he an old god himself? Or are they the same entity that Mel just constructs as something different from her own perspective, from her religion? And speaking of old gods, how do werewoods work? Well, it seems to be blood. Bran saw a blood sacrifice in his visions in A Dance with Dragons. He apparently possibly even eats Jojen in what people call Jojen paste to unlock his green seer abilities, according to Bloodraven and the children within the tree. And now that I think about it, in A Feast for Crows, when Brienne was actually looking for Sansa, she ended up killing a mummer. They had previously been the mummers that captured her and Jaime, ends up killing them specifically under a weirwood tree. So I think these trees are actually powered off the blood of men. There's no other reason for it to specifically mention she killed somebody under a weirwood tree other than to tie Brienne and her storyline into Bloodraven's storyline, or perhaps Bran's as well. So did she kill this guy and then kind of feed the wood? Did she unlock something? Did she pay for a life with a death? Or perhaps it's due to the sword she's carrying. She's carrying Oathkeeper that used to be ice. So perhaps the sword is of some importance. I think a lot of people have speculated that that may be Lightbringer, if in fact Lightbringer is a literal sword. And again, Mel sees Bloodraven, she doesn't know who he is yet, but in her flames as the Great Other, or at least his champions. So although we know that he is with the old gods, followers like her of the Red God R'hllor would want to burn the old trees like the Andals and First Men did. So I think that's also setting them up in opposition as well. But Bloodraven also helped Sam and Gilly as far as them escaping down to the wall through Cold Hands, I believe. I believe Cold Hands is a minion of Bloodraven's, and if that's the case, he is helping Gilly and Sam, or is he helping the baby perhaps, since Craster's son was taken when he was supposed to be sacrificed to the others? So in this case, that seems to again set Bloodraven up against the others, as opposed to being with them. And then you got to take into account the others' perspective. I mean, what do they want? Why are they coming back? Was it due to the fact that there was some treaty broken from the past? Was it because sacrifices to them at the Night Fort stopped? Does it have something to do with Craster's sons or the missing son? But then again, they're active right in the beginning of our story before Craster is killed and stops sacrificing his son. So it's hard to say. And just to throw this in here, because it's kind of really cool to me for historical context, ravens are used now to carry messages. Well, in the old days, as Bloodraven explains to Bran, the ravens actually did it themselves and spoke the words because people warged them. So with all that said, I know this video has gotten a little too long, but let me quickly summarize in regards to what I think Bloodraven's up to and what's going on, and I want your input for sure. I talked about in Bloodraven Part 1 that he had killed Aenys Blackfyre, and that's why he was eventually sent to the wall. So think about this. If Bloodraven never kills Aenys Blackfyre, Egg never becomes king, and then goes on to, first of all, produce Dany down the line. The second thing that would come from that is he would never have been sent to the wall. If he's not sent to the wall, he never goes beyond the wall ranging and finds the Children of the Forest. If he never finds the Children of the Forest, he never becomes the last Green Seer and never finds Bran. We don't know exactly what Bran's going to be up to, but basically I think he's going to take his place, and that's going to be probably against the others in some way, shape, or form. So I think all this was set up a long time ago. I think he's been influenced in events since the very beginning. He probably knew of the future. He probably knew what was coming. So everything was probably set up to get him sent to the wall, become the last Green Seer, help shape events for the coming War for the Dawn, and then eventually recruit Bran to take his place, as he will eventually die. My question for you guys is, what do you think he's up to? What do you think his goals are? Where do you think his end game is? What other examples do you guys have about how he shaped events during our story in the first place? What do you guys think he wants with Jon? What do you think he sees in Melisandre? Does he see her as the enemy as she sees him as the enemy? So thanks guys, let me know what you think. I'll be doing another GOT Q&A video as well, but in the meantime you can click here for my Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens review, and also let me know what you think there about how you thought The Force Awakens played out. Anyway, thanks again you guys, thanks for all the support, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.